Now, I've told you this before. My parents growing up never, ever once took us camping. Did you know why? Because they loved us. They weren't going to take us and make us sleep on the ground and eat food that's fallen in the dirt and have bugs crawling all over us and bite us. I don't understand it. To go and pay money to camp outside and sleep outside, on some level, it's got to be an insult to the homeless, right?
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
So what I'm going to do in this series is I'm going to take the word rock, R-O-C-K, which we use a lot around here, have you noticed? And I'm going to take that word and I'm going to use it as an acrostic, and I'm going to talk about 4 different things in this series. Number 1, that Jesus restores our relationships. Number 2, that he overcomes every opposition. Number 3, that he creates in us character. Number 4, he keeps us kingdom-minded. So today we're going to start with Jesus restores our relationships. See, when Jesus came, his mission on earth, I believe, was to restore our relationship with God first, and then with one another second. That's the picture of the cross, the vertical and the horizontal. And we got off the track real soon. See, as soon as man fell in the Garden of Eden, his human relationships, once he broke that relationship with God, once that was broken, then the relationships with another were trashed. They were put off the rails. All you have to do, what were Adam and Eve's kids? Who remembers the first 2? Adam and Eve's first 2 kids were Cain and Abel, and Cain killed his brother Abel. Bad start. And then we have Jacob. He steals his brother's birthright, his twin brother Esau. And then we have, of course, Saul, who wants to kill his own son-in-law, who's married to his daughter, David. And then we have David's son, Ammon, who rapes his sister, Tamar. And then we have Absalom, David's other son, who kills his brother, Ammon. I don't think this is a good picture. I don't think we're doing real great with this. And so Jesus comes along to restore the relationships. And if we don't get that relationship with him right, we'll never get this relationship right with one another. So here's where we're going to go. We're going to start in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 13. I'm going to warn you, this verse is just going to plain confuse you by the time I'm halfway through. But we're going to read it anyway because it's important. It says, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the law of commandments contained in the ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace, and that he may reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity." How many of you were good till about the first line, and then he pretty much lost you after that? This is so confusing. Talking about these two and coming together as one, and the enmity and the law of ordinances, da-da-da-da. Let me dumb it down for you because I'm an expert at this. This is what he was saying. He was saying, because you are far from God, your relationships are broken with him and with one another. And what Jesus did was he came to restore not only the relationship with God, but with one another, and he has broken down the middle wall. He's specifically referring to the Jews and the Gentiles and how they hate and kill each other. And he says what he's done is broken down that separation between the two of you, as he has brought you together as humankind, as one body and one people. And he will do the same. When we get our relationship right with God, I'm telling you, everything else falls into place. And that was Jesus' mission. He did a lot of things while he was here. He told a lot of stories and a lot of parables, but fundamentally what he came to do was to restore our relationship with God, and if he could do that, we would get our relationships with one another right. That's why the great commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your might, all your soul, and all your strength, and to love who? Your neighbor as yourself. That's the message of the gospel and how it works. So here's what I want to do, because how are we going to get there? I'm going to throw it up on the screen. Here's my 4 points for today. And they are this. Number 1, meaningful relationships are built on intimacy. Number 2, good relations can resolve conflict. Number 3, stable relationships rise above sensitivity. And number 4, enduring relationships require forgiveness. So the first thing is this, that meaningful relationships, if they're really meaningful, they require intimacy, which is not talking about sexuality, by the way, like Marge Simpson thinks it is. It's talking about closeness and the fact that people have to be close on some level. And here's what we think. We think that the basic needs of mankind are food, water, shelter, air, etc. And if we have those things, we can live. Not true. And we're going to have to move beyond superficial relationships because we are actually hardwired, and I'm going to prove it to you today. We are hardwired for relationship. We are hardwired for intimacy. And science has recently discovered this thing they call them mirror neurons, and that our brain is wired in such a way we have literal physiological neurons in our brain that when we interact with other human beings, our neurons fire in mirror image of the person that we are connecting with. And it is something that actually produces intimacy. Now, here's the picture. You'll love the picture. Look at these two just communicating on this bionic level. It's fantastic. I mean, for me, this is nothing new. I watched Star Trek years ago in the 60s. It's called the Vulcan Mind Meld. You remember that, right? You know what? Dr. McCoy does not look like he's enjoying that. But he has synced his mind to his other. And so science has actually proven that non-verbally, we actually connect on a neurological level one with another. So I have to tell you this story. So you all know I have grandkids, and this is what I preach about now instead of my children because they're old and boring. And I have these great grandkids, and the 2 oldest ones are preschoolers. And you know what? Being a grandpa is not that great. They don't really dig you as the grandfather because you don't have much to offer. Unless I bring them candy or McDonald's, they pretty much ignore me. Now, when Kathy comes in, my wife, she comes in, they go nuts because she actually babysits them 2 times a week, and she is their playmate. And when she comes into the house, they literally do this. Ah! And you know what they do when they see me? They turn and walk away. And I thought, I don't know how to get through these kids. I've been bribing them, and I'm doing all this. So then my daughter had a 3rd child, and I thought, maybe I'll do a better job with this one. And I just adore her. She's so sweet. And the thing is, she doesn't have the good sense to ignore me quite yet. And, you know, she's not old enough. She's only 10 months old. And anyway, I kiss her, and I hug her, and I love her, and I show all this affection. So then the other day, I was actually out in the backyard with my son-in-law. We were doing something, and my daughter, Kristen, came out, and she was standing on the deck with Margot. And when Margot saw me, she reached out her arms like this, 10 months old. I went up to the deck, and I grabbed her. She buried her face in my neck. And my daughter said to me, I have never seen her do that with anyone. And I said, mirror neurons, Kristen. We are tracking and connecting on a subconscious neurological level that you could never possibly understand. And so my point of this whole story is that we are hardwired for intimacy and relationship, and we are meant to be. God created us that way. So we see Jesus. And I want to talk about how he got them. Like, how do you take people like the 12 disciples from superficial relationship to meaningful relationship? And this is true with every generation. You know what the answer is? Camping. You take them camping. If you want, see, here's what camping does. Camping produces closeness, and closeness produces intimacy. Right? And so that's why camping is a key. I've told you this before. And what happens in camping is you go and you sleep in this little confined space in a tent with no doors and no windows, and you sleep in sleeping bags 1 inch from one another on the ground. It's dreadful. You know, but it will do something in you. Now, you know, I've told you this before. You know, my parents growing up never, ever once took us camping. Do you know why? Because they loved us. They weren't going to take us and make us sleep on the ground and eat food that's fallen in the dirt and have bugs crawling all over us and bite us. I don't understand it. To go and pay money to camp outside and sleep outside, on some level, it's got to be an insult to the homeless, right? So here's what Jesus does. He takes these 12 guys, this disparate group of guys that I'll talk about in a moment, and he takes them on a 3.5-year camping trip. Have you noticed? They're always walking, they're always outside, they're always under the stars, they're always sitting by the campfire. And I'm wondering, we see them occasionally going into a house for a meal. Did they ever bathe? I mean, who even knows, right? What was Jesus doing? He was producing intimacy in these men. I mean, they were fishermen, and they were all these different occupations. They were guys, and he wanted them to connect on an intimate level with God and with one another. So we find John. Remember what John is called? He's called the apostle of love. And so you read his gospel, it's ridiculous. He refers to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. How about that? How would you like it if I did that? Every Sunday morning I got up here. I said, hi, I'm Pastor Mark. I'm the pastor that Jesus loves. You think I was kind of weird. But anyway, that's what John does. He said, now the disciple that Jesus loves was lying by Jesus and laid his head on his breast. Are you imagining this picture for a moment? This is so uncomfortable for me when I think, what is this grown man doing with his head laying on Jesus' breast? And why isn't Jesus uncomfortable? Get off of me, you big lug. I mean, this guy was a fisherman. Fishermen stink, right? They stink. Old fishermen never die. They just smell like it. And I don't think you'll ever get that fish smell out of you. And yet he's lying there, all calm, with his head on Jesus' breast. I'm thinking, what are these guys doing? Am I the only guy here that thinks this is a little weird? Apparently I am. There are modern commentators that somehow think this has something to do with sexual orientation. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that Jesus was producing a godly, homely, platonic relationship with other men, and they understood they could have some level of intimacy and it's not weird. And I want to tell you a little story about this, because if those of you familiar with the East Indian culture will know this, that East Indian men in public will hold hands with one another. Lesser so in North America, but they still do it from time to time. You see it, especially if they don't think other people are watching, because we all make all kinds of assumptions these days. But when I was in India years ago, you would see men walking down the street, 4 of them abreast, particularly the young man, holding hands, and it was actually kind of a macho thing to do. It was what they did. It was kind of like how we punch guys in the shoulder. They hold one another's hand. And there's nothing sort of sexual about it. And in fact, in the days when I was there, it was inappropriate for a man and a woman to walk down the street holding hands, but perfectly culturally acceptable for 2 men to do it. So anyway, I'm in India. I'm there for 3 weeks. I get assigned this young translator. He's about 20 years old. His name is Joel. And he spent 3 weeks with me. Are you ready for this? On a camping trip. Basically, that's what we were doing. We were south of Hyderabad in the Andhra Pradesh deserty region of India. We were traveling around in a hired car. We were sleeping in different places. I hung out with this guy, ate every meal with this guy, and we became good friends. You know where this story is going, don't you? So then one day, we're walking down the street, and we're going to whatever destination we were going to, and he reaches out and takes my hand. And I went, not doing this. and I pulled my hand, and I scratched my nose, pretended I had to scratch my nose, because my other hand was clearly busy. And so then we were walking down a few minutes later, and he takes my hand again. And this time I had to tell a story, and I needed both my hands to tell the story. And so that was my excuse. The third time he took my hand, I stopped and I said, all right, Joel, that's enough. I am not holding hands with you. Maybe that's okay in this culture, but I don't care where I am in the world. I have a reputation to uphold, and I am not holding another man's hand. And I didn't get mad at him, but he understood what I was doing. And here's what we have. We have this hang up about intimacy with other human beings, which is actually fundamentally wrong. And if Jesus can have the disciple lie with his head on his breast, and don't get me wrong, I am not going to hold your hand either, just for the record. But I will hug you, and I will love you, and I'll be your friend. And here's the thing. You can't have intimacy with everybody. But there are a few people in this world that if you don't have intimacy, I'm telling you something, you are missing something about meaningful relationships. So the first thing is this, is that meaningful relationships require intimacy. The second thing is that good relationships can resolve conflict. We're always going to have conflict. If you have relationships, conflict goes with the territory. It's just the way it works. And so I want you to think about Jesus' group of men that he picked, these 12 people. He had these 3 sets of brothers that were all fishermen. That was half his team. And the rest of the team were these random people that are hard to describe. You've got Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector. Those two would have hated each other, right? I mean, Simon the Zealot was fighting against the Roman occupation, and Matthew the tax collector was extracting taxes from his own people to give to the Romans. They would have hated each other. They would have slit one another's throat. And everybody hated Judas, right? Judas was a thief. He held the money. He was stealing it. They all hated him. And so Jesus goes and picks this group of people, don't miss this, that were designed for human conflict. And you see the conflict. You can read the stories in the gospel. And what happened was they got past every single one of them. Jesus never reacted to the conflict. He always showed them a better way. And in the end, let's jump to the very end of the story after Jesus is gone. This group of men, with the exception of Judas, who hung himself, they would have given their lives for one another all day long. He transformed them because they learned how to overcome conflict and resolve conflict in their life. There's a couple of quick keys I'm going to give you on this. The first story I want to tell you is the story of Abram and Lot. Abram and Sarah had been off in Egypt, and they'd come back to the area that we know today as Canaan's land, or Israel, and they'd come back to the homeland. And Abram had a nephew named Lot. And they both had herds, and they lived together, and they worked together. They were on a camping trip. Go read the book. They were on a camping trip. They didn't have houses. They dwelt in tents. They were literally camping. Everything I'm going to tell you today is about camping, because camping is the secret. And so anyway, they're on this camping trip, and it says there was strife between the herdsmen of Lot and the herdsmen of Abram, and they couldn't figure out whose herds were whose. And so then Abram goes to Lot, his nephew, and he says, I don't want strife, conflict between us, I pray. So let's make a compromise. Let's make a deal here. He says, look, the land is expansive. There's room for both of us here. And he says, if you go this way, I'll go that. And if you go that way, I'll go this way. And so then Lot took the well-watered plains. Do you remember that? And he moved his herds down into the plains, which were, probably the superior area. But Abram stayed up in the highlands with his herd, and both of these men prospered. Why? Because they were willing to compromise to resolve the conflict. And someone had to be the bigger man. I always tell people this. I always say, somebody in this situation has to be the bigger person, and I think it should be you. Now, if I was talking to the other person, I would tell them I think it should be them, right? I think that's how that works. So we have a New Testament story that I think is sort of fascinating, and it's another camping trip. Do you remember Paul and Barnabas? They were best friends. They were partners in ministry. You know what they did? They went on camping trips. Now, they called them mission trips. You can call them whatever you want, missionary journeys. I look at them. They were on camping trips, working out their relationship. And do you remember on their first camping trip, they took John Mark with them? And John Mark, just for the record, that's Barnabas' cousin. He's related to him. So they bring him. It turns out he didn't like camping. Remember this? And they're on this missionary journey. They're on this camping trip. And he didn't like it. He goes running home to mama. He didn't like camping. So then when Paul and Barnabas were deciding to go on their second camping trip / mission trip, Barnabas wanted to bring John Mark again. Paul said, no way, Jose, not taking him. He's a loser. He's a mama's boy. He can stay home with his mama. I don't want him. And it said it was no small contention, and they could not resolve it. Do you remember this? Now, here's my question for you. Who was right and who was wrong? Paul right or was Barnabas right? You know what the answer is? It doesn't matter. There is no virtue in a relationship in being right. I mean, seriously, like married men, let me talk to you for a moment. You have a choice to make in your marriage. You can be right or happy, but not both. you get this, don't you? Right? And here's the point I'm making about this, is that it really doesn't matter if you're right and wrong. If you're going to resolve a relationship, you've got to get over that, because wanting to be right, needing to be right, is a relationship killer. And I'm going to tell you a tragic story, true story, happened right here on Pembina Highway. There's a bunch of schools along Pembina Highway here, and we have crosswalks. And you push the button, and the lights blink, and you're supposed to stop your car. And this kid's coming out of school, and he goes to the crosswalk, and he pushes the button. It's blinking yellow, and he steps out on the street, and a car hit him and killed him. This happened a few years ago. And my question for you was he in the right? Was he in the right to step out in the street? Yeah, he was. He was actually in the right. But what difference does it make? He's dead. There's no virtue in being right. And the problem is we always want to be right. And when I look at people fighting, and I look at people arguing, and I look at the conflicts in life, so many times we make the big mistake of needing to be right. You don't need to be right. Right is a recipe for failure. So, you know what we had? We had 2 years of a COVID pandemic where everybody was mad at everybody. Did you notice that? About everything. And there was conflict everywhere. And it was an opportunity. It was a test for us to decide whether our relationship was more important than being right. And here's what I did. I'm just going to tell you what I did. I had people on both sides of this thing. My family was pretty much split down the middle. I had people that were anti-vax, and people who were pro-vax, and anti-mask, and pro-mask, and it went on like this. And I decided that I was not going to lose not one single relationship over masks or vaccines or mandates or any of these. It didn't matter what my opinion was. And in very many situations, I decided that I was going to let the other person be right if they wanted to. And so I would say to them, literally, I'd say, well, you know what? You're probably right. Were they right? Of course not. I'm the one who's always right. I know I'm right. It doesn't matter. They're not right, but that wasn't the point. There's no virtue in being right. And so I would say to these people, you're probably right. And I think I successfully managed to maintain every one of those relationships. And you heard me say this. In the middle of the pandemic, I said, why are we fighting about these masks thing? In 6 months, we're going to forget all about this. And in 6 months, we're going to look back at this and we're going to say, remember we used to fight about masks? Wasn't that silly? Because now it doesn't matter. Now here we are, and nobody's fighting about masks. Some people wear them, some people don't. Nobody's fighting about them. Nobody's talking about them. Moral of the story, I was right. That's the moral. That's the moral of that story. So the first thing is that meaningful relationships require intimacy. The last thing, or second thing rather, is that good relationships can resolve conflict. I'm going to crash land these last 2 points. I will finish this message. And the third thing is this, is that stable relationships rise above sensitivity. How many of you notice we live in this hypersensitive world? That everybody is offended with everything. And you know what? Jesus promised us that would be the day we lived in. He said, you will hear of wars in the last days. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. There'll be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. And he says, the love of many will grow cold, many will hate each other, and many will be offended with one another. And if we aren't living in that time, I don't know what time we're living in. And I look around me, and everybody's offended about everything, and they wake up in the morning just looking for something to be mad about and looking at someone to be offended with, and you can't say anything about anything because somebody's going to be offended. And I see it in personal relationships. And if conflict and the inability to compromise is a relationship killer, sensitivity is even worse. And what happens is we allow our feelings to get the better of us. And here's the thing. Your feelings are your feelings. I'm not going to deny you your feelings. If you feel hurt, if you feel offended, if you feel like someone slighted you, that feeling might be right. It's not important. You have to learn to manage your sensitivities. We can't go through life sabotaging our relationships because we're offended by everything everybody does and everything everybody says. And let me give you a biblical example of this that is pretty profound. I mentioned earlier that Saul was trying to kill his son-in-law, David. Does anybody remember the circumstances behind that, the turning point when he became so offended with him he wanted to kill him? Does anyone remember? It was the moment when they came back from war with the Philistines and the women started singing, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And from that moment, the scripture says he was offended with his son-in-law David and sought to kill him. He was jealous. What a ruddy baby. What is wrong with you? You are the king of Israel, for goodness sakes, and you're going to be offended by this little shepherd boy? So what? And here's what happens with us. We get trapped, we get caught up in this sensitivity thing. We allow our feelings to get the better of us, and we destroy our relationships as a result of this. And I'll tell you something. More often than not, the thing you perceive that person thought isn't even correct. It's not, you have inferred something that didn't even happen or wasn't even said. I'm going to tell you a little story about this. So one Sunday, I'm preaching here, and there's a woman sitting just right over there. And I was preaching, and I said a particularly good point. I say a lot of them. I made a particularly good point, and I looked over there, and she shook her head like this. And I thought, what? Are you serious? And it caught my eye. And then I was preaching, I was going over here, and I made another point that I thought was even better. So I thought, I'm going to check this one out. So I looked over at her, shakes her head like this. And I thought, are you kidding me? What is wrong with you? And I thought, I'll show her. I'm going to ramp this up to a whole new level. And so I started really pushing, and I was preaching up to beat the storm. And I looked over there. I thought, she's going to be loving this. And I looked over there, and she was shaking her head even more vigorously at me. I think, what is this woman's problem? But that day, it just got my goat. And every time I looked over at her, she was shaking her head. And the more animated and the more excited I got, the more she was shaking her head. By the end of the message, it was going back and forth like this. And I thought, when I'm done here, I'm marching down there, and I'm going to give her a piece of my mind. And so I walked down there, and she came up to me, and she reached her hand out to me to shake my hand, shaking her head like this and smiling, and said, Pastor Mark, that was such a great message. I felt like you were talking right to me. I'm thinking, I was talking to you. And you were shaking your head the whole time. She says, I hope my shaking head didn't bother you. I have Parkinson's disease. I thought, I'm such an idiot. Why did I perceive, why did I infer that that's what she was communicating to me? And that's the trap that we find ourselves in. Last and final thing is this, is that, throw it up there because I can't remember what it was. It'll be good though, whatever it is. So don't shake your head. Enduring relationships require forgiveness. I'm setting this all up to this. We have this conflict, and we got the sensitivity, and we got the intimacy. All those things are a recipe for you needing to forgive. And so they're on this camping trip, Jesus and his disciples, and Peter's having a day. And he turns to Jesus and he says, like, how many times do I have to forgive my brother? Like, 7 times? And Jesus said, 7 times, 70 times, which is 490 times. That's a lot of times. Or in other words, you know what he was saying? You've got to forgive everybody. Oh, I'm so glad you can quote that. I mean, that's my life motto. You have to forgive everybody all the time. It doesn't matter what they do, what they say. It doesn't matter how you feel. It doesn't matter what conflict you're in or the sensitivity that you might feel in your heart. You have to forgive everybody all the time. It's the absolute key to a success in relationship. And if you can learn to do this one thing, if you can learn to forgive everybody all the time, I'm telling you, there is no relationship in this world that cannot be restored, because God is on your side, and he wants to get us to restore this relationship first with him, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, and this relationship second, to love your neighbor as yourself. And one of the great keys is, of course, to forgive everybody all the time. Let's stand together.
If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.